Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries.
Welcome, friends. This is Dane Rome, your announcer for today's Last Days Beacon program. Thanks for listening, and thank you for joining us. Just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you would like to contribute to this ongoing faith ministry, which deals with biblical prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us. You'll find a donate link on the homepage. The website address again is www.swpm.us. And thank you for your prayers and support for this faith ministry. On today's program, Dr. Schnitker continues his discussion with constitutional attorney Bill Olson. Bill Olson's law firm in Washington, D.C. has presented 100 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Today's discussion will deal with a couple recent cases that you'll find very interesting. Let's join them now.
It is a real privilege to have constitutional attorney Bill Olson back on our program today. For those of you who tuned in last week, you may recall that Bill heads the law firm William J. Olson, P.C., attorneys at law in Washington, D.C. Bill is a personal friend of mine and a member of the Advisory Council of Southwest Prophecy Ministry. I've asked Bill to rejoin me on the program today. We had a great informative broadcast last week about his new website, biblicalgrid.com. Well, today we're going to transition and talk about some legal issues. As Bill mentioned last week, his law firm has been privileged to bring 100 cases, amicus briefs, before the Supreme Court of the United States over the past several decades. We're not going to give Bill's age away, but he was not a contemporary of George Washington, though I'm sure he has a great deal of respect for him. And so they have just reached this milestone of 100 cases brought before the Supreme Court. And so they have been diligent, he and his 5 associates, in trying to preserve our constitutional liberties in Washington, D.C. And I, for one, am encouraged to know that there are Christian lawyers, that's almost an oxymoron, but that there are Christian lawyers in the D.C. area that are diligent in trying to preserve our constitutional liberties. So, Bill, welcome back to our program today.
Well, thank you, David. Glad to do it.
Remind our listeners who weren't with us last week of the web address for your firm.
You know, our law firm address is www.lawandandfreedom.com, which describes hopefully what we try to do, preserve a little bit of freedom through the use of law.
And it's a great website. We talked about it a lot last week, but if you're looking for a lay-level introduction to constitutional law, Law and Freedom is a great resource for you. Well, we couldn't begin a discussion of the Supreme Court without asking the standard question that every journalist has asked in the last, 6 weeks, and that is, what do you think of the latest Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch?
Well, it's interesting. I wrote an article with Larry Pratt of Gun Owners of America about a case that Gorsuch was a part of majority on when he was on the U.S. Court of Appeals, having to do with gun rights, and it was sort of a mixed result in his approach, not to get too deeply into that case, but there, as with so many people who are on the bench, until they really face a case that is, an abortion case or a homosexual rights case or a property rights case or something at the core of the Second Amendment, you really don't know how they will respond. So I think the truth is that although there are lots of reasons to be encouraged, we still don't know how Gorsuch will rule. I do have one insight, which is that his mother was Anne Gorsuch, And Ann was a friend of mine back in the Reagan administration. I was involved with the presidential transition in 1980 into 81 with her. She had been a lawyer, a member of the Colorado House of Delegates, and President Reagan put her in as the first woman director of the Environmental Protection Agency. And he did that because she understood the limits on government power, not because she was a rabid environmentalist. And she did a great job there. And unfortunately, when she took some hard stances against Congress, which was not dominated by President Reagan's friends, the Reagan Justice Department, run by William French Smith, did not come to her assistance. And so very many of the Bush people in the Reagan administration, and of course, unfortunately, the Reagan administration was filled with Bush people. It was very disappointing, and eventually, since she would not be defended by the Justice Department, she resigned and had to leave office. So I think it might have been instructive for Justice Gorsuch, who at the time was a teenager, to understand that sometimes the people in the same party are not necessarily your friends. But anyway, his mom was principled, tough, bright, terrific lady, and good on all issues, and I certainly hope he picked up those good genes.
Well, time will tell.
Yes.
And I'm sure that it won't take much time to tell because of the issues that are continually being brought forward to the court. Well, speaking of such issues and cases, we talked offline about two cases that you wanted to bring to the attention of our listeners. And so share with us those cases and why you consider them so important.
This is remarkable. California and the Ninth Circuit is everything people think it is. The first case had to do with it's called Welch versus Governor Brown, and it has to do with a state law which prohibited mental health professionals from counseling minors against homosexuality. There were exceptions if you wanted to affirm somebody's homosexual behavior, but it was a ban on counseling people against homosexuality, and actually could take the mental health professional and make them subject to disciplinary action from whatever their regulatory body was.
Can I pause you for a moment? Just to give a little historical perspective, there's what's considered the Bible of counseling or psychological counseling is the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and they're on the 5th edition. But in the earliest editions of the DSM, homosexuality was treated as a mental illness. I don't know if you were aware of that, but that shows you how far we have come or how far we have fallen as it relates to this whole subject.
Yeah, it was 44 years ago that they took homosexuality out of that category in the DSM, and that's exactly right. And then if anybody wants to understand how they did that, you can look on YouTube for some videos by Dr. Nicholas Andrew Cummings, who is the former president of the American Psychological Association, who talks about the takeover of the APA by homosexual-friendly interests and how they had engaged in certain threats to the profession if they did not yield on this issue, and how the psychologists in the country capitulated. It's quite an extraordinary story. But in any event, right now, there are very few people who believe in what they call reparative or conversion therapy, but there were some doing that in California with minors. The minors were not comfortable with their same-sex attractions. Their parents weren't comfortable, and they would counsel with them, and that's now prohibited. So they say you have to go out of state if you want to do that, or you have to wait till you're 18. And it's remarkable to think that they're going to use occupational licensing, which is designed to usually implement some minimum standards, only to turn professional licensing into a political correctness test, and that's where we are. We're also seeing the American Bar Association do that, saying if you're critical of homosexuals, then you're abusive, and you shouldn't be allowed to practice law if you were hostile and abusive.
So wouldn't the net effect of that at the far end in both of those disciplines result in conscientious Christians being barred from both the mental health and the legal profession?
Well, it's really where we're headed. We're headed where medical doctors have to be pro-abortion, where mental health professionals have to be pro-homosexual, lawyers have to be politically correct on everything. It's one of the reasons that although most Christians accept the notion of occupational licensure, and they say, sure, the state ought to have minimum standards, not everybody should be able to hang out a shingle and say they're a surgeon, but the consequence of that is that it means the government decides if you can have a job. And it used to be that it was only maybe 5 or 10% of the population that was subject to occupational licensure, but now it's enormous growth of the number. I mean, in Virginia, for a long time, we were regulating hair braiding. You needed to have a license from Richmond to regulate to participate in hair braiding.
How long will it be before there's a philosophical litmus test for that as well?
Well, the people in the business didn't like people coming in from the Caribbean and undercharging them, so they set minimum experiential standards, and it's just abusive. And this is, of course, a pretext. There's no, it's not a matter of good psychology, psychiatry, or other mental health practice. It's simply politics, and we want to try to make homosexuals feel normal, feel happy about themselves, and frankly, we just can't do that. We can't make them feel happy, and it's extraordinary. I don't know if you knew this, David, but we gathered some statistics for our brief, and of people who try to commit suicide within the general population at some point or another in their life, it's 4.1%, which I find extraordinarily high. But for transvestites, it's 41%, 10 times as much. This is not a normal behavior.
Or a healthy one, apparently.
Or healthy, yes.
From a psychological perspective. Almost half.
We supported this, the First Amendment, the religion clauses, the free exercise clause is designed to protect the exercise of religion. What's religion? Well, we know from Madison and Jefferson that religion is the duty we owe to our Creator, which is not enforceable by violence or force. And the government uses violence and force. That's the definition of government. So what we want to do is protect all people from government control over their religion, which is not just religious people. It's not just Christians or Jews or whatever. It's not religious people. You could be an atheist, and you have a freedom of religion in America. Religion is a jurisdictional term. We're trying to explain this to the court in the terms that Madison and Jefferson and George Mason used, and our briefs detail this. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has already denied certiorari in the case and will not review the case. So the Ninth Circuit decision upholding this terrible law banning mental health professionals counseling minors against homosexuality has been upheld, basically.
Did the Supreme Court give a basis for their rejection?
No, when they deny, they just deny in almost all cases. Every once in a while, a justice or a group of justices will dissent from a denial of certiorari, and then they'll publish something explaining it. Clarence Thomas does that sometimes, and it's very helpful because he really gives encouragement to the people who are being denied review to fight another day. But in this case, there were not any justices who did it.
That's discouraging, isn't it? Not a single one.
No.
Wow.
There is another California case, if you want to talk about that quickly.
Yes.
The other one has to do with abortion, and it has to do with a law that was passed to stifle the work of crisis pregnancy centers. And they divide them into different groups, different types. They have different regulations, but basically the crisis pregnancy centers in California, about 200 of them, which are trying to urge people to protect life and not to have the abortion, they are now supposed to hand out literature saying, don't worry, please, you can go to the California government or to one of these other centers and they will have taxpayer-funded abortion to help you. So in other words, they're requiring the pro-life crisis pregnancy centers to hand out pro-abortion literature.
Let me ask this in the interest of fairness. Is Planned Parenthood required to give referrals to pro-life organizations for those that they, quote, counsel?
No.
That's rhetorical. Well, that would seem to be a fair and even-handed approach, wouldn't it? To make alternatives available at whatever organization, they should make all the alternatives available and known?
I wish I had talked to you before we wrote our brief. I think I would have used that.
I think it's a valid point.
It's an excellent article, excellent argument. But our brief and our approach was to say this is the equivalent of California adopting itself as a ministry of truth. It's going to take an issue, a spiritual issue and a political issue and a moral issue, and it's going to decide it based on psychological and principles and public policy principles, and they're going to push whatever side they want of the debate. And the key to a constitutional republic, as Thomas Jefferson once said, that to compel a man to furnish funds for the propagation of ideas in which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. That was his bill for establishing religious freedom in 1779. But here they're taking taxpayer money to promote abortion, and even though the money came from pro-life taxpayers, and they're requiring these organizations to distribute the pro-abortion literature even if they are pro-life. So it's compulsion. The government is compelling the private organization to carry its water, to carry its message. And we don't think the government has the right to take a side in a debate like that to support abortion. We don't think the government has the right to compel people who disagree with it to carry the message of abortion. And we explain this in some detail and the First Amendment principles involved. The only good news on this one is that the Supreme Court hasn't yet ruled. So there is still hope. Of course, there's always hope, but in this case, the petition is still pending, and we haven't yet heard from the court as to what they're going to do.
Is the petition listed or stated somewhere on your website?
Yes, it's on the home page, and the name of the case is National Institute of Family Life Advocates, known as NIFLA, N-I-F-L-A. And the brief is posted there. It was filed on April 20th of this year, so quite recently. You know, if you have time for another thought, one of the sad things about a number of Christian legal groups is that they simply have no understanding of the historical and textual meaning of the religion clauses in the First Amendment. And they actually argue these cases by saying that religious people ought to have special privileges. They think that the freedom of religion is a freedom to protect religious people. Well, that might be a rationale to win a case, but it's not historically accurate, and ultimately it's a weak reed on which to rely. Because if you take a look at the language of the First Amendment it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it has a word religion. The question is, what does that mean? Well, it had a meaning in 1791. It had a meaning. So what is the free exercise of religion? And then you go back to the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, only 3 years before, which defined the term religion. And religion is the duty we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it, which can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. So this is a matter between us and God, religion, the position we take on these issues, how we feel about things. And the government has no right to come in and to tell us what side of the debate we're supposed to be on. And interestingly enough, by the way, even though the word Christian doesn't appear in too many of these early documents dealing with the definition of religion, Thomas Jefferson repeatedly talked about our Creator in his Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom. And the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is still part of the Constitution of Virginia, says that it is our mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. Isn't that beautiful?
It certainly is. So there was an assumption when they talked about religion as being the Christian religion.
It really was. Although if you, I mean, they were all looking at it from the standpoint of biblical truth. They said, and Jefferson's quite interesting about this because, you know, people always say he was a deist. He never said that about himself, but people say that. He was much more doctrinaire than, or doctrinally correct than people give him credit for. But he talks about how Almighty God hath created the mind free, and that He who would have the right to coerce us, He doesn't coerce us. So what business does the government have to coerce us as to our heart and our feelings and how we think? It's only our actions that they can control, and only there within the confines of what is a lawful restriction. So it's really quite exciting to think that at the beginning we had some clear thinking about what religion is, and the definition of religion is not the same as religious people. Even atheists have freedom of religion. We can think what we want, no matter whether we believe in God or not. God doesn't coerce us, neither should the government.
So it's an even-handed liberty that the founders were espousing.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's get back to the this particular brief. Give the name again of the brief and the website. And the final question would be, how can our listeners support you in your efforts with this particular bill?
Well, this is the name of the case, the abortion case, is NIFLA, National Institute of Family Life Advocates. That was filed, our brief was filed on April 20. The other one, homosexual counseling, the name of that case was Welch versus Brown. That was filed on March 2nd of this year. Both of them are available on our website, which is www.lawandfreedom.com. And that and all the other briefs we filed are up there. We filed something like 17 now on LGBT rights, which many people don't want to touch. We've gotten involved in those, and you know, this. There's no question. This is spiritual warfare, especially on the life issue, and yet, you know, so I'm not sure how people, you know, can support what we're doing, except to say that. You know, the Apostle Paul warned us that these are spiritual battles, and prayer is a spiritual weapon. So we invite all of that assistance that we can possibly seek.
Well, unlike legal issues in terms of bills, etc., and things that go before our legislative body, perhaps it's self-evident, but lobbying by the citizenry is not really effective as it relates to legal cases that come before the Supreme Court, is it?
No, actually, we just did some work on this having to do with the right to petition government. It has to do with petitioning the executive and the legislature, not the judiciary. Courts aren't really supposed to be listening to which side has more people on it. They're supposed to be faithful to the text of the Constitution and the statutes. but they certainly need a lot of work in that area.
Yes, I've participated in the National Right to Life March a few times when I lived in the D.C. area, and it doesn't appear that the masses marching in the street have had any market effect on the Roe v. Wade decision. Certainly the prayers...
There are many reasons for that, and the problem is that most of the people who get elected saying they're pro-life don't want to do anything about it because they want the pro-lifers to help them the next time, and the next time, and the next time.
Right.
If they ever solved the problem, they would get rid of their political base.
Now that sounds downright cynical.
That's a pretty jaded view, but
it is.
Only after 40 years of this have I come to that conclusion.
And I'm sure you're aware that former Congressman Ron Paul would bring a sanctity of life bill before Congress, I think every year, and never found a co-sponsor on either side of the aisle.
Well, what's even more remarkable is that very often the opposition to good pro-life legislation comes from groups that raise money as being pro-life. And you say to yourself, how could that be? But in Virginia here, I've heard some recent stories in Montana and other states, the pro-life groups will very often meet in the back room with the state legislators, just as they do in Washington, and they'll say, and the legislators say, we don't want to have this vote. This is going to be really hard for our people. They're going to have to make enemies if they support this bill. We don't want it to come to the floor. We'll give you a vote next year, or next year, or next year, but not now. And the pro-life groups who want the Republicans reelected say, okay, we'll just keep raising money.
So it works for both parties, doesn't it?
Everybody wins except for the babies.
Sad but true. Sad but true. Give the web address once more before we close out today.
The law firm's website is lawandfreedom.com with about 650 items posted on there, easily indexed and categorized.
Well, thank you, Bill, for joining me for today's shows. And let me encourage our listeners to be praying for Bill and his associates. They are on the front lines of liberty, fighting for your constitutional liberties, often before the highest court in the land. So we would appreciate your prayers and your education via his excellent website, lawandfreedom.com. So, Bill, thanks for joining me today and last week as well.
Thank you, David.
And now please give your attention to our announcer, Dane Rome, as he shares about our featured product for this month.
Thank you, Dr. Schnitker. Dear friends, this month we are featuring an excellent DVD entitled Vaxxed, From Cover Up to Catastrophe. In 2013, biologist Dr. Brian Hooker received a call from a senior scientist at the CDC, who led the agency's 2004 study on the measles, mumps, rubella, or MMR, vaccine, and its link to autism. The scientist, Dr. William Thompson, confessed that the CDC had omitted crucial data in their final report that revealed a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism's. Over several months, Dr. Hooker recorded the phone calls made to him by Dr. Thompson, who provides the confidential data destroyed by his colleagues at the CDC. Interviews with pharmaceutical insiders, doctors, politicians, and parents of vaccine-injured children reveal an alarming deception that has contributed to the skyrocketing increase of autism and potentially the most catastrophic epidemic of our lifetime. You may obtain a copy of this 91-minute film entitled Vaxxed, From Cover Up to Catastrophe for a gift of $24.95 plus shipping. Simply go to the homepage of our website, www.swpm.us, to find the film. The website again is www.swpm.us. Please join us next week for another Last Days Beacon program brought to you by Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Until then, This is Dane Rome, and thanks for listening.